Hello, and thank you for watching this webinar. The aim of the work of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics that I'm presenting here was to identify ways in which research can be conducted ethically in emergencies. And this is recognising a real dilemma that good quality evidence is essential for effective response, both now, as we see in the COVID-19 pandemic, and for the future. However, emergencies are highly non-ideal circumstances in which to conduct research. This was a 2-year inquiry supported by an international and interdisciplinary working group, and it led in January this year to the publication of a detailed report with policy recommendations for a wide range of stakeholders, including research funders, governments, journals, ethics committees, and researchers themselves. Alongside the report, we also published a call for action highlighting headline recommendations, and we're really pleased that a number of key organisations in the UK and beyond have publicly aligned themselves with this. That includes Welcome, the humanitarian organisations International Rescue and Médecins Sans Frontières UK, and then leading research institutions such as the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and the Medical Sciences Division of Oxford University. During the inquiry, we had input from researchers, responders, research participants, and policymakers from over 30 countries. And this was crucial to the legitimacy of this project, given that while we're a UK-based organisation, this project clearly has global relevance. So, for example, we received diverse contributions via an online open call for evidence, as well as hosting meetings in the UK and flying people in. We also hosted and attended meetings in the Philippines, Singapore, Lebanon, Senegal, the US and China. We produced some case study literature reviews looking at community experiences in 4 very different emergencies. So the Indian Ocean tsunami, the triple disaster in Fukushima in Japan, Hurricane Katrina, and the ongoing Syrian civil war. And we also had an international external review process of an early version of our draft report. The scope of the inquiry was very broad in terms of the kind of emergencies covered, the kinds of research, and also, I think importantly, what we considered to be an ethical issue. So in terms of what counts as a global health emergency, we took a very inclusive approach, including infectious disease outbreaks, such as, of course, the current COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, tsunamis, hurricanes and the like, and human-made disasters, including conflict. While these differ clearly in important ways, they also have shared characteristics that make research particularly challenging. So these characteristics include disruption from some kind of norm, great health need, both at individual and population level, time pressure to act that can be at real odds with standard research timescales, great uncertainty, and then really importantly, the human elements, the anxiety, the distress, sometimes panic that emergencies engender that affect how participants behave and respond and how researchers and others behave and act. We're concerned with global rather than purely domestic emergencies in the sense of emergencies that involve support from outside the country. So this might be in terms of direct humanitarian support, as for example in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and the ongoing outbreaks in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But it can also be in many other ways, such as in the need for international collaborative research that we've seen in the current COVID-19 outbreak, even when it was still centred in China. So to be clear, we'd regard the current outbreak as global long before there were cases outside China, precisely because in order to respond, there was a real need for international collaborative research. And the reason for this approach to what counts as global is because when an emergency involves a multi-country and multi-agency response, this brings extra ethical challenges through the scope for tensions over control, responsibility, and legitimacy. In brief, who is calling the shots and who is accountable to whom, and what further ethical questions does that generate? We also took a very broad approach to the kinds of research that might play a key role in effective emergency response. So these include the biomedical and epidemiological research that perhaps first springs to mind, so including the research underpinning diagnostics, vaccines, new treatments, but also perhaps the more hidden social science and anthropological research that is crucial, both in understanding the nature of the health threat, for example, in understanding how human behaviour influences transmission in outbreaks, and understanding the needs and concerns of those affected. We also noted how evidence-gathering activities in the humanitarian sector, such as needs assessment and evaluation, while not strictly speaking research, often raise similar ethical issues. And then finally, in terms of scope, the working group were very clear that ethical concerns are not limited to questions of ethical review, and this is a really important theme of the report. So in particular, questions of power and influence about who makes decisions, whose voice is heard, and whose needs and whose opinions matter are fundamentally ethical as well as political. And we suggest these need to be considered alongside the more traditional research ethics questions of trial design, recruitment, and consent, which of course remain equally important. And then, as well as keeping the welfare of participants rightly at the forefront of our minds, we also need to think about what is owed to researchers, particularly the frontline researchers who are often operating in very dangerous and difficult circumstances. Moving on then to our ethical approach. Our working group developed what we called an ethical compass to guide decision making, both for those on the ground and importantly also for those at policy level, recognising that decisions taken by policymakers, often a very, very long way away from the emergency, can have a profound impact on what happens and what can happen on the ground. The compass is made up of 3 core values that emerged from the evidence and experience people shared with us during this project. And I'd like to emphasise that these values were not identified top-down from existing values and principles, though I'm sure they look very familiar. Rather, they emerged bottom-up from the input we received, that these were the values that were being challenged, that were guiding people's conduct on the ground in emergencies. So first, helping reduce suffering. This is the fundamental reason why research is conducted in the first place in emergencies. We're not talking about research for research's sake. And there's some really important questions of power and perspective here. Whose suffering are we concerned with? Who's defining that suffering? Is the suffering we're concerned with, does that relate to people's most important needs? Second, demonstrating respect for others as moral equals, which we've abbreviated to equal respect on the slide. So this links with the question of who is defining suffering and hence how we prioritise research goals. It also prompts us to ask how communities will be involved in planning research, how studies can be designed in ways that are sensitive to local values and traditions, and how we can be confident that research participants are treated respectfully throughout the whole research process, not just focusing, as we sometimes do, at the point of consent. And then thirdly, fairness, considered in a number of different ways, in terms of distributive justice, looking at the benefits and burdens of research and how these are distributed. Also in terms of discrimination, so who's being excluded, recognising that excluding people from research with the aim of protecting them may also exclude them from the benefits of research because we don't have data on how the intervention at stake affects people like them, or we don't hear their voices in needs assessment. Then in terms of process, are the processes used seen to be fair? And finally, in terms of working relationships, particularly between international, national and local researchers, where there may be really big differentials in terms of financial power, in terms of general clout. It's really important to recognise that these values may at times be in tension, and there will be no easy answers to the ethical questions and the ethical dilemmas that arise. As in the application of human rights, for example, there will be a need for trade-offs, in the same way that we recognise that some human rights have at times to be qualified or restricted in order to respect the rights of others or the general public. But none of these core values can be overridden entirely. We cannot say, for example, that fairness or equal respect can simply be disregarded altogether. Sometimes it may simply not be possible to do research because of the difficulties of the emergency situation. It may be simply impossible to conduct it in ways that are even minimally fair or respectful, for example. But when coming to these decisions, and that will be a decision for researchers and sometimes a decision also for you as ethics committees, it's important to include consideration of the opportunity costs of not doing research and taking account of that as part of the balancing, the trade-off exercise. Not doing research isn't always the safest option. Our detailed report uses this ethical compass to consider policy implications across 6 broad areas of research, as detailed on the slide. And these are also summarised in the short policy version of our report, available on our website, and I'll come at the end of this webinar to links to those documents. Now I'm going to focus first on the call for action I mentioned at the start, which includes the top-line recommendations to those such as research funders and governments who have real power to change things on the ground, and then to the recommendations specifically to ethics committees. In our call for action, first we argue that funders have a duty to work in partnership with governments and others to ensure that participants' basic health needs are being addressed throughout the response effort. And this is in order to avoid the fundamentally unethical situation of people in dire straits without access to services being asked to take part in research to benefit others. And I think of all the examples of problematic and unethical research that we were faced with during our inquiry, that was the kind of scenario that came up repeatedly and we felt was particularly ethically troubling. I should emphasise it's not usually a duty for funders themselves to fund or provide these services, except perhaps as emergency contingency measures. But it is their duty to expect the researchers they're supporting to work in partnership with response services in this way, so that, for example, they can be confident about referring people in need to services or know who to contact if, for some reason, services are not getting through to this particular cohort of people. Second, we recommend to both funders and governments that they should invest in community engagement mechanisms for the long term, recognising that community engagement is absolutely core to ethical research in emergencies, but of course, by definition, in emergencies, it's very hard to set up quickly. So for funders, this should be a routine part of major research projects, and for governments, this should be embedded in the healthcare system, for example, through community health workers and volunteers. And for example, we heard from Ebola survivors leaders and those involved in organising community engagement during the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, their appeal to their governments to keep the really effective systems that had evolved during that crisis in place for the future. Third, we highlight the need to promote equitable collaborations between research partners in low and high income settings, with a particular focus on ensuring that partners in low income settings have the opportunities both to influence the research agenda and to gain credit from their involvement, not just being used as data collectors in other people's projects. And again, I think that was probably the next most common concern that we heard during our inquiry. And finally, and perhaps most crucially, we identify the need for ongoing commitments for emergency planning. And I think we're seeing the importance of that again in the world's response now to the COVID-19 pandemic. The central role played both by robust health systems and by effective research systems in emergency preparedness, and the need to keep the eye on the ball politically and financially in between emergencies to make sure that those systems are developed and maintained. So what does all this mean for research ethics committees? Well, starting with community engagement, we suggest that ethics committees are well placed to encourage and reinforce the importance of community engagement. And as a minimum, should expect researchers to have engaged with affected communities in the development of appropriate communication tools and consent procedures. Where possible, community engagement should go further, but that should be a minimum. They should also scrutinise proposed exclusion criteria, for example, pregnant women or children, and expect really clear justification for any that are proposed. And in making these kind of judgments, local knowledge will be really important, for example, in understanding the risks both of inclusion and exclusion in this particular context. And of course, you as ethics committees will not usually have access to that local knowledge, so it'll be a question of whether the researchers are able to justify it with respect to local knowledge, or also obviously input from the local ethics committee too. Then, in considering consent processes, ethics committees should consider whether the information and the procedures proposed are the best and most sensitive that are possible to achieve in the circumstances. But it's important also to think about the limitations of consent, to recognise that in some circumstances, people may realistically have very few choices, and they're going to say yes to research participation, whatever, what social scientists call an empty choice. So in these cases, of course, consent is important, but it's also really important to think about other ways to ensure that participants are shown respect as moral equals. And one very important example, this could include the way that community members have been involved in developing the research, because the more involved they are, the more confident ethics committee members can be that this study is really meeting local needs, sensitive to local concerns, and hence is much less likely to be exploitative. Recognising that consent isn't everything, we then suggest a final cross-check, as it were, to ask yourselves, given all the circumstances, can we say it is fair to ask people to take part in this study? And then finally, a really practical issue that comes up over and over again that seems so often to be neglected. If we're asking people to take part in our research, invest their time and emotional energy in answering our questions, quite apart from any physical risks or burdens, we owe it to them to tell them later what we found out, how they've contributed to future knowledge, or indeed to current outbreak response. We're asking funders to make sure there is ring-fence funding for this kind of follow-up communication as a routine part of making grants, but it's also a key issue for ethics committees to raise with researchers. All the detailed materials, from the full-length report to the 16-page policy summary and a one-page overview for ethics committees, are available free to download on our website, and the links are there on the slide. Thank you very much indeed.